When the British Empire expanded across the world, it carried more than soldiers, merchants, and ships. It carried ideas, beliefs, and faith. For many, Christianity arrived with promises of hope, education, and change. For others, it arrived with pressure, disruption, and the reshaping of older traditions. From the 1600s to the 1900s, religion became one of the most powerful tools of connection and conflict within the empire. It offered comfort to some, and challenge to others. This is the story of empire and Christianity. Hello and welcome. I hope you are doing well today. And thank you for spending your time here on this journey through history. Today, we explore how Christianity moved with the British Empire. How missionaries, churches, and schools spread across continents. And how faith became linked with the idea of civilization, duty, and destiny. For some communities, Christianity brought literacy and new opportunities. For others, it changed traditions, replaced systems, and reshaped identity. This is not a story to judge or accuse. It is a story to understand. Before we begin, here is something to think about. Did Christianity spread through genuine belief, or through imperial influence that made it difficult to refuse? The first missionaries 1600 to 1700. The story begins quietly. Their holds are filled with cargo meant for trade, not conquest. Their captains talk of profit, not empire. But where commerce travels, people travel with it. Among the merchants, sailors, and company agents are missionaries. They do not command fleets or negotiate treaties. They step ashore with books, letters, and a belief that their mission is one of guidance. When British traders begin building connections overseas, they arrive in ports linked to East India Company trade, though they are not part of the company itself. Their journey is not funded by government departments. It is funded by donations, churches, and private supporters who believe that the world is changing and that they have a place in that change. Their presence is quiet, almost unnoticed in the noise of docks and markets. Yet they carry with them ideas that will ripple outward for centuries. They reach the coasts of Africa, the islands of the Caribbean, and towns in India. Their first chapels are small, sometimes nothing more than wooden structures built near trading stations. They share space with warehouses, customs offices, and merchantsa homes. Their services are held in rooms where the wind travels through open windows and the sound of ships never fully disappears. They learn new words, write notes on local languages, and attempt to understand the places where they have arrived. At first, their presence is limited. They are few in number, and their influence is uncertain. They speak instead to sailors, workers, and neighbors who live near the ports. They teach children reading and writing. They provide small schools in coastal settlements and offer medicine to those who approach them. Their role appears gentle, almost secondary to the trade that surrounds them. Yet something deeper is unfolding. In Africa, chapels rise near warehouses that handle goods exchanged along the coast. The missionaries build relationships one conversation at a time. They write letters home describing distant landscapes and cultures they are only beginning to understand. They are guests, not administrators. They believe they are offering guidance. They do not yet see how their presence will intertwine with future systems of rule and commerce. In the Caribbean, mission houses stand near plantations and ports. Some missionaries oppose harsh treatment of workers and call for change. Others support structures already in place. Their motivations vary. Some seek to convert. Some seek to educate. Some seek to offer comfort. Some seek to educate. Some seek to offer comfort. They are part of an early chapter in a story not yet fully formed. In India, chapels appear near trading posts that are expanding into fortified stations. Missionaries work alongside interpreters and teachers, learning local customs and sometimes adopting local languages to communicate. The line between religion and trade remains separate at first. But over time, trade shapes the environment into which missions are built. Where the company establishes footholds, missionaries soon find permission to follow. The foundation is set. The link between trade and faith begins here. No document states that commerce must lead to conversion or that chapels must follow cargo. Yet the pattern emerges naturally. Traders build routes. Those routes create settlements. Settlements create space for schools and churches. Churches create cultural bridges that influence identity as much as belief. One step follows another until the path appears intentional even when it was not. Missionaries write journals that speak of purpose. They describe themselves as travelers in service, not agents of empire. They do not see themselves as a force of control. They see themselves as bearers of understanding. Yet their presence supports a wider transformation. Over time, their schools introduce new languages. Their lessons reshape expectations. And their moral arguments influence how authority is understood. Some communities welcome them. Others refuse. Some approach with curiosity. Others keep their distance. Their work is slow, measured in conversations rather than victories. But the patience of their approach does not diminish its impact. It simply delays its recognition. Where trade goes, faith soon follows. Not in the form of armies or demands, but in ideas, words, and rituals. Carried across docks and thresholds. They are built in the shadow of sails and fort walls, but they speak to a different kind of influence. One that affects belief rather than borders. One that shapes identity rather than territory. One that affects belief rather than borders. One that shapes identity rather than territory. By the end of the 17th century, the pattern is established. Missionaries travel to port cities where British ships already anchor. Their writings influence perception. Their presence offers a doorway through which larger cultural forces will later pass. They do not begin the empire. They do not plan the empire. But they stand near the places where the empire begins to imagine itself. The century closes with unanswered questions. Did the missionaries support the world being built around them, or were they carried along with it? Were they agents of change, or witnesses to it? What began as devotion will later intersect with administration. What began as education will later support governance. The connection between trade and faith will shape the centuries that follow. In this early era, the missionaries are like seeds planted in soil that had not yet been plowed. Their roots are small. Their reach is limited. But they are present. And in history, presence is often the beginning of influence. Between 1650 and 1750, the Caribbean became a focal point of British expansion. Islands that had once been scattered stops along maritime routes grew into territories tied closely to imperial vision. Trade, administration, and plantation systems developed rapidly, shaping how life unfolded on the ground. Alongside ships, merchants, and officials came another presence that carried influence of a different kind. Missionaries, churches, and religious teachers arrived with the ambition to guide, instruct, and reshape society. Christianity became part of the region's transformation, weaving itself into daily life, education, and cultural expression. Missionaries traveled across the Atlantic with a purpose that blended faith and structure. They built churches in growing settlements, beginning with simple wooden structures that expanded as congregations increased. These buildings became more than places of worship. They acted as gathering spaces where news was heard, agreements were discussed, and ideas circulated. Through sermons and instruction, missionaries presented systems of belief that emphasized discipline, obedience, and moral order. Many spoke of transformation and improvement, convinced that their presence could alter the direction of social development. Religious schools soon followed. Lessons combined reading, writing, and basic numeracy with teachings rooted in Scripture. Some missionaries believed literacy would help individuals navigate a changing world and ease daily hardship. Others saw education as a tool for cultural guidance, shaping the beliefs, routines, and expectations of those they taught. Classrooms became spaces where ideas about society and morality were reinforced. Learning was not just academic. It was directional. The influence of Christianity grew gradually, then steadily. It did not replace older beliefs instantly, nor did it settle without resistance. Instead, it entered life through conversation, interaction, and routine. Hymns were sung, prayers spoken, lessons memorized. Biblical stories mixed with the rhythms of island life. Religious holidays joined the calendar alongside existing traditions. The new presence did not remove what had been there before, but it shifted the balance of cultural expression. Over time, the church became a marker of identity in communities shaped by many forces. Some missionaries sought to reduce suffering and provide relief where they could. They challenged cruelty, documented grievances, and wrote letters to officials in Britain. Their efforts spoke to conscience rather than commerce. These individuals believed faith demanded action and responsibility. Their work did not dismantle the systems around them. But it revealed that moral concern existed even within a structure built on unequal foundations. Others used the language of moral instruction to encourage new behaviors aligned with imperial expectations. They promoted discipline, loyalty, and acceptance. They framed obedience as virtuous and disruption as dangerous. Their teachings often echoed the priorities of those who governed the region. The connection between belief and authority became clearer. In some places, sermons supported the notion that British rule brought order. In others, religious leadership questioned the actions of officials when they believed justice was being ignored. Christianity did not speak with one voice. It reflected the perspectives of those who practiced it. Churches became cultural centers. Weddings, funerals, baptisms, and weekly services structured life in ways that reached beyond the spiritual. These events created community identity, even among people whose experiences were shaped by systems of control and limitation. Music, scripture, and ritual formed emotional memory. The church became a place where individuals could belong, even when the world outside its walls remained difficult. In its best moments, it offered care. In its worst, it reinforced the boundaries set by imperial structures. As Christianity expanded, its connection to empire became increasingly visible. It traveled alongside trade routes and within the protection of naval power. It arrived in territories where authority was already shifting. Missionaries relied on colonial infrastructure, even when their intentions differed from those who built it. They wrote reports to British societies that funded their work. They referenced figures of governance when negotiating for land and supplies. The relationship between faith and empire became interdependent, even when motives diverged. The British government understood the influence that came with religious presence. Churches could stabilize communities by offering routine and social guidance. Missionaries could soften the image of expanding control by framing intervention as benevolent. The idea of moral improvement provided justification for policies already tied to profit and administration. Faith became part of a narrative that made the empire sound responsible rather than ambitious. For individuals living in the Caribbean, the experience was complex. Some accepted Christianity and reshaped it to fit their own identities, blending older traditions with new practices. Some rejected it and held firmly to existing beliefs. Others moved between systems, choosing elements that spoke to their needs. Faith did not arrive as a single outcome. It arrived as a force that people navigated, interpreted, and sometimes changed. By 1750, Christianity had become more than a spiritual presence. It was cultural, educational, and political. It existed in classrooms, legal discussions, and public life. It shaped expectations and behavior. It offered comfort and provoked tension. It provided language for compassion and language for authority. It stood at the crossroads between local experience and imperial ambition. The Caribbean of this era revealed how influence travels without armies, how beliefs can shift without force, and how culture can reshape itself under pressure. Missionaries. Hope to save souls. Administrators. Hope to stabilize rule. Merchants. Hope to strengthen markets. In the spaces where these intentions met, Christianity took root as one of the earliest forms of imperial influence in the region. Between 1650 and 1750, the Caribbean changed not only through trade and governance, but through the arrival of a belief system that carried ideas about morality, society, and identity. Churches rose beside ports. Schools appeared near plantations. Hymns joined the sound of ship bells and market calls. Faith became part of the structure of life, woven into the everyday experiences of those who lived in a world shaped by empire. Its impact would endure, not unchanged, but continually reinterpreted by the generations that followed. India and Education Mission 1757–1830. After the Battle of Plassey in 1757. What had started as a trade relationship shifted into a structured system of authority. The East India Company expanded its control. And with that expansion came new influences that reached beyond commerce and governance. Establishing schools teaching new subjects and opening classrooms in places where imperial power was growing. Missionaries entered India with a wide range of intentions. They established schools, translated religious texts into local languages, and created networks of learning. They spoke of reform, uplift, and understanding. Their work took them into towns, villages, marketplaces, and ports. To them, the schools were a gift, a service offered in the name of progress. But the impact of these missions was not understood the same way by everyone. To others, the education they brought did not simply add to what existed. It reshaped it. Local traditions of learning, inherited and developed over generations, found themselves competing with a new system. Subjects once taught through community memory were replaced by textbooks produced overseas. Lessons centered on new priorities, and the missions became part of a larger structure that influenced identity and authority. The connection between missionaries and administration grew over time. As British rule expanded, so did the reach of mission schools. They trained interpreters who could work for the company. They introduced students to legal and political systems that supported colonial governance. Many missionaries wished to serve the public, but their work also supported the machinery of rule, whether or not that was their intention. In classrooms, children sat at wooden desks and repeated lessons that reflected the worldview of those who taught them. Geography charts described distant nations that claimed global authority. History lessons presented the empire as a stabilizing force in the world. Students learned that speaking it opened doors to employment and influence. Knowledge became a pathway upward, but the path required accepting new rules. This transformation did not happen quickly. It unfolded gradually, through new schools in port cities like Calcutta and Madras, and in inland regions connected by trade routes. Teachers learned local languages so they could communicate. But many expected their students to learn English in return. Small institutions expanded into larger ones. Classrooms multiplied. Examinations replaced oral traditions. Learning changed shape. Meanwhile, traditional education did not disappear. It adapted. Sanskrit schools continued to teach philosophy. Madrasas continued to study law and theology. Scholars preserved older systems of knowledge. But they felt the pressure of the growing influence around them. Families debated where to send their children. Some chose mission schools for opportunity. Others resisted, fearing what might be lost. The empire described these changes as progress. Officials pointed to new schools as proof of improvement. They spoke of literacy, development, and the future. They used education to justify expansion. They presented the classroom as a symbol of guidance and responsibility. To them, it was evidence that rule was not simply an act of control, but an act of leadership. Yet in India, experience varied. Some students discovered new ideas that allowed them to question authority itself. Education did not always create obedience. It sometimes created resistance. New knowledge led to new expectations. Graduates began to ask who benefited from the system and why. They learned to speak in the language of reform. They learned to write petitions, organize associations, and communicate arguments. The same tools introduced to strengthen imperial rule gave future generations the means to challenge it. In this way, mission schools became part of a paradox. They supported the empire and shaped those who would later oppose it. They taught loyalty, and they taught criticism. They introduced structure, and they inspired change. They created pathways to employment within the administration. And they nurtured voices that demanded independence from it. This was the complexity of the era. By the early 19th century, the relationship between education and empire was undeniable. Schools and missions had become part of a larger system. They existed not only as places of learning, but as instruments of influence. They offered knowledge, but that knowledge came with expectations. They taught skills, but those skills fit into a structure built beyond India's borders. Some missionaries believed deeply in their work. They saw classrooms as places of improvement. Others, even with good intentions, stood within a system that used education as a tool of authority. The motivations varied. The outcomes did not always match the goals. Between 1757 and 1830, the line between reform and replacement remained difficult to define. In towns where the company governed, the missions became another presence connected to empire. Their schools stood beside administrative buildings, courts, and trading houses. The empire pointed to these institutions and described them as evidence of progress. It said that India was being prepared for a different future. It said that guidance was necessary. It said that education was a gift. But many in India looked at the same classrooms and saw something else. They saw systems that overshadowed older traditions. They saw identities rewritten through textbooks. They saw knowledge shaped by someone else's priorities. To them, the missions represented more than schooling. After 1757, British rule expanded with armies and administration. But it also expanded through classrooms. Christian missions became connected with authority. Education became a language of power. Some saw it as service. Others felt overridden. And between those two experiences lay the story of a nation in transition. Africa and the century of expansion from 1800 to 1900 is a story shaped by movement, belief, and control. As the 19th century begins, European influence along Africa's coastline stretches inward. Paths that were once trading routes become roads for missionaries, administrators, and officials. Churches rise beside new outposts. Schools open where village markets once stood alone. Clinics appear near garrisons and trading stations. The idea of empire does not travel alone. Missionaries cross rivers, plains, and forests, carrying the conviction that they are bringing spiritual transformation. They build structures that become centers of community life. Classrooms fill with students learning new languages and new scriptures. Medical care provides help that some communities welcome, easing illness and offering treatment. In many places, acceptance comes from the hope of opportunity, knowledge, or security. In others, it comes from necessity, as the cost of refusing grows heavier. The spread of Christianity in Africa does not follow a single path. In some regions, people adopt new faiths willingly, seeing them as a bridge to wider trade, literacy, or political support. Converts form congregations and participate in churches that grow beyond their original mission. African teachers and preachers rise within these systems, shaping Christianity into forms that reflect their own cultures, languages, and values. Faith becomes something adapted rather than imposed, renewed through local expression. Elsewhere, conversion unfolds alongside pressure. Colonial laws favor those who participate in new administrative systems. Mission schools become gateways to employment in government offices or foreign-owned companies. Those who accept new forms of education gain access to written communication and trade networks. Those who refuse may find themselves outside the opportunities that define a changing world. Faith and authority, though not identical, become aligned. As borders shift, so does the balance of governance. Treaties draw lines across maps, often without full agreement from the people who live there. Administrators use churches and mission centers as points of contact, places where influence can be extended. Laws are introduced that reflect European systems of property, hierarchy, and labor. In some regions, local leaders cooperate, working to preserve stability or retain partial authority. In others, leaders resist, challenging changes that conflict with established customs and responsibilities. The 19th century becomes a period in which religion and governance intertwine. Churches become locations where laws are discussed. Mission schools produce clerks, translators, and intermediaries who connect communities to colonial offices. Clinics add legitimacy to the presence of foreign authority by providing care that did not previously exist in the same form. Each institution becomes more than itself. It becomes a tool, intentionally or not, in a wider system of expansion. Communities respond in different ways. Some embrace new structures and find ways to navigate them. Some blend Christianity with existing spiritual traditions, creating forms of worship that reflect older identities as well as new beliefs. Others resist, maintaining distance from both church and administration. Resistance can take the form of refusal, negotiation, or relocation away from expanding borders. Not all opposition is open. Sometimes it exists quietly, in the continued practice of older customs behind closed doors or away from mission centers. By the middle of the century, European presence grows more organized. Missionary societies coordinate their work through letters and reports sent back to London. Schools increase in number, teaching literacy and arithmetic alongside religious instruction. Clinics experiment with new forms of care, connecting European medicine with local knowledge. The intention to uplift and the intention to govern sit side by side, neither fully separable from the other. As the century advances toward its final decades, the political reality becomes clearer. The scramble for Africa redraws borders with speed and ambition. Missionaries find themselves working in regions where authority shifts rapidly, where one colonial flag replaces another. The idea of spiritual development becomes attached to the structure of imperial control whether missionaries intend it or not. Their presence can legitimize the arrival of officials and companies. Their schools create generations prepared to work within the new systems, even when those systems reduce autonomy. In many regions, African Christians begin to push back against foreign leadership. They demand local control, local clergy, and independence in worship. Newspapers and pamphlets written by African scholars appear, questioning authority and describing futures beyond imperial supervision. Leaders argue that spiritual equality must be reflected in political and social equality as well. By 1900, the century of expansion reaches its turning point. The connection between religion and governance has reshaped daily life. Churches and mission schools remain central institutions, but they no longer belong solely to those who built them. They become places where identity is preserved, altered, or rebuilt. The legacy of the century is not one story but many, stretching across regions, cultures, and generations. Stretching across regions, cultures, and generations. Some communities carry forward Christianity as a faith they chose to shape themselves. Others remember the pressure that accompanied its arrival. Many hold both memories at once. The result is a landscape defined by complexity rather than a single narrative. The century of expansion does not end with a conclusion, but with a question that will continue into the next era. What began as a mission of faith and governance becomes a story of transformation and consequence. Across Africa, churches, schools, and clinics remain, but so do the changes brought by borders, laws, and authority. The century of expansion leaves foundations that future generations will challenge, adapt, and redefine. As the 19th century progressed, parts of the empire saw religious institutions grow alongside political administration. In many regions, churches and missions arrived just before or just after official governance. By the 1800s, churches were closely linked with aspects of colonial administration. Mission stations became places of translation, negotiation, and social influence. Clergy sometimes served as intermediaries, carrying messages between officials and local leaders. Their words offered a moral vocabulary for a system that was otherwise rooted in economics and military presence. Religious schools prepared students for forms of governance modeled on British ideals. Sermons spoke of duty, obedience, and reform. Belief and authority began to move in parallel. Some local leaders converted to Christianity, not solely for spiritual reasons, but to gain access to education, negotiation, or political dialogue. Conversion could offer a path to recognition in the eyes of the administration. It opened doors to literacy programs, translation work, and advisory roles. Education in mission schools created a generation of students who could communicate with colonial officials. For some, this provided possibility. For others, it created tension within their communities. Western-style legal systems were introduced through religious schooling. Mission classrooms taught not only reading and writing, but also concepts of law, property, and government. Lessons presented British structures as universal frameworks. Students learned courtroom procedure, administrative processes, and civic responsibility as defined by foreign authority. In time, these students became clerks, translators, and interpreters within the colonial bureaucracy. Education became a quiet instrument of governance. Faith, law, and authority began to overlap. Churches hosted discussions that influenced policy. Mission reports helped shape laws drafted thousands of miles away. The pulpit and the office desk became connected by shared language. Religious language offered justification for legal decisions. Legal authority offered protection for church expansion. Each institution supported the author's presence. In some places, this system brought access to knowledge, healthcare, and new forms of community leadership. Mission hospitals treated illnesses that had once been fatal. Schools offered instruction to people who had never had access to formal education. Literate students returned to their towns with skills no one else possessed. These experiences reshaped social structures, creating new roles and expectations. In these cases, change appeared as opportunity. In other places, the overlap brought conflict. Traditional beliefs were challenged by imported doctrine. Local legal customs were replaced by systems that did not reflect community history. Elders found their authority questioned. Cultural practices were judged through foreign values. This tension did not always erupt into open resistance. More often, it lingered quietly, creating divisions that would last long after the 19th century ended. Churches became places where identity and power intersected. Some congregations used faith to negotiate better treatment or protections from officials. Others used it to resist in subtle ways, preserving local customs behind closed doors. The empire did not control belief completely. Communities shaped religious practice into forms that blended old and new. Even within conversion, autonomy endured. Government offices relied on mission networks to understand unfamiliar societies. Reports from pastors or educators informed decisions on taxation, land policy, and administration. Clergy described languages, social hierarchies, and customs. Their accounts influenced how empire imagined the places it governed. These descriptions were sometimes respectful. They were sometimes simplified. They always shaped perception. The overlap also influenced Britain. Newspapers published accounts of missionary work abroad, describing moral duty alongside political presence. Parliamentary debates referenced religious reports to justify intervention or reform. Public opinion connected faith with governance, even if the connection was imprecise. The Church became part of the story Britain told itself about its place in the world. By the late 19th century, mission schools fed the ranks of local administration. Legal courts relied on individuals trained in religious institutions. Clergy advised policy makers. Policy makers defended missionary presence. The connection was not absolute, but it was influential. Belief and policy moved forward together. This does not mean every missionary supported imperial rule. Nor does it mean every official valued religious influence. But it existed. It shaped how empires justified their presence. And how communities navigated the changing landscape of power. The consequences of that overlap continued long after the 19th century ended. In the 20th century, leaders of independence movements emerged from mission schools. Writers, lawyers, and politicians used the language they learned to challenge the authority that taught it. Legal systems introduced as tools of empire became instruments for self-rule. Education that once supported colonial administration became a foundation for resistance. The relationship turned in unexpected directions. Today, the legacy of this era can be seen in courtrooms, school curriculums, and places of worship across former colonial regions. The structures created between 1830 and 1900 did not disappear. They adapted. They were reinterpreted. They became part of national identity in ways their creators could not have predicted. Church and government once stood side by side in the shaping of empire. Their partnership influenced policy, culture, and law. It left a mark on institutions still active today. The 19th century fused belief with authority, faith with structure, mission with governance. And from that fusion came a legacy that history continues to unravel. Education, literacy, and new identities 1850 to 1914. They are small schools with wooden desks, chalkboards, and teachers who have come from far away. In many places, it will. Mission schools bring literacy and access to global knowledge. Students learn to read words that connect them to ideas beyond their villages, towns, and coastlines. They learn writing that allows them to travel with their minds long before they travel with their bodies. Mathematics introduces a new logic, a way to measure markets, plan accounts, and navigate systems that are becoming tied to global trade. Translated texts offer entry into worlds of science, philosophy, and history. Education becomes a doorway, and those who pass through it step into a future their ancestors could not have imagined. For many, this creates new opportunities. Students become clerks, teachers, interpreters, and administrators. Some become diplomats, journalists, or lawyers. Education builds confidence alongside skill. It nurtures new leadership, new ambition, and new voices. In time, these voices will grow strong enough to challenge the systems that introduced them to the wider world. But in this moment, the change feels personal rather than political. A shift within individuals as much as a shift within societies. For others, the experience is more complicated. Younger generations learn lessons that older generations never received. This creates distance within families and communities. Traditions once passed down through storytelling and memory now coexist with notebooks and printed pages. Elders watch as children write in new languages and read from texts that reshape how they understand the world. Some see this as progress. Others see it as loss. Christianity influences identity, not only spirituality. It changes expectations about daily life, social roles, and morality. It reshapes customs surrounding marriage, mourning, and community leadership. New holidays appear. Old ceremonies fade. Parents may practice one set of beliefs while their children practice another. Entire communities negotiate the space between what they have inherited and what they have learned. This transformation does not happen all at once. It happens lesson by lesson. Word by word. A student copies a sentence from a board. A teacher explains a passage. It happens lesson by lesson. Word by word. A student learns. This transformation does not happen all at once. It happens lesson by lesson. Word by word. A student learns. This transformation does not happen all at once. It happens lesson by lesson. Word by word. A student learns. This transformation does not happen all at once. It happens lesson by lesson. Word by word. A student learns. This transformation does not happen all at once. It happens lesson by lesson. Word by word. A student learns. This transformation does not happen all at once. It happens lesson by lesson. Word by word. A student learns. This transformation does not happen all at once. It happens lesson by lesson. Word by word. A student learns. This transformation does not happen all at once. It happens lesson by lesson. Word by word. A student learns. This transformation does not happen all at once. It happens lesson by lesson. Word by word. A student learns. This transformation does not happen all at once. It happens lesson by lesson. Word by word. A student learns. This transformation does not happen all at once. It happens lesson by lesson. Word by word. A student learns. This transformation does not happen all at once. It happens lesson by lesson. In some places, mission schools work alongside colonial governments. Literacy becomes a requirement for work in offices that manage land records, trade permits, and transportation networks. Those who can read have access to worlds closed to those who cannot. Education becomes a measure of opportunity. It becomes a border that divides futures. Those who cross it gain choices. Those who do not remain tied to older systems that were once sufficient but are now being overshadowed. Yet education also creates unintended consequences. Students who learn to read law books learn to question authority. Students who learn world history learn that no system is permanent. Students who study philosophy begin to think independently. A generation that learns the vocabulary of power will eventually learn to speak it for itself. Meanwhile, mission schools continue to expand. Teachers train local assistants. Local assistants become teachers in their own right. Education spreads, not only through foreign instruction, but through communities taking control of what they have learned. Some schools remain closely tied to missionary work. Others become secular. Some teach only basic literacy. Others prepare students for international universities. The variety is as wide as the empire itself. Families adapt in their own ways. Some embrace the new systems fully. Others blend old and new knowledge. Some resist, hoping to preserve traditions they believe are at risk. The result is not uniform. It is layered, like a map of overlapping identities. Identity becomes something negotiated rather than inherited. By the late 19th century, literacy is transforming public life. Newspapers appear in port cities and major towns. Debates spread through letters and articles. Poets write in languages their grandparents did not speak. New ideas travel faster than ships. They move through ink and paper, carried by students who once sat at wooden desks in small mission classrooms. Education becomes more than a skill. It becomes a force. Between 1850 and 1914, the world shifts. The spread of literacy creates new political thinkers, who will one day demand representation. The study of law creates reformers, who will one day argue for rights. The introduction of history creates citizens who remember the past differently. The growth of journalism creates storytellers, who challenge official narratives. What began as a tool for administration becomes a tool for transformation. But in this moment, the transformation is still forming. It is still gathering strength. No one can yet see the full shape it will take. Missionaries believe they are spreading knowledge. Administrators believe they are creating useful workers. Students believe they are preparing for the future. All are correct, and all are mistaken. Education changes more than anyone intends. It opens doors no one planned to unlock. By 1914, a generation educated under these systems stands ready to define itself. Some will seek degrees abroad. Some will lead schools of their own. Some will enter government. Some will resist it. Some will form new identities, neither fully traditional nor fully colonial. All of them will live in a world changed by the spread of letters, books, and classrooms. Education brought literacy. Literacy brought confidence. Confidence brought questions. And those questions will shape the century to come. In the end, identity did not disappear. It evolved. Between 1857 and 1914, the British Empire confronted a truth it had not fully expected. Expansion did not guarantee acceptance. Authority did not guarantee agreement. Some encounters unfolded quietly, shaped by negotiation and adaptation. Others erupted into conflict when cultural expectations clashed with systems of rule. Resistance emerged in many forms, revealing that belief, identity, and tradition could not be reshaped as easily as borders on a map or laws in an office. The empire learned that control had limits, and those limits appeared wherever people felt their world being remade without consent. In 1857, a major uprising in India turned discomfort into open conflict. Tensions had been building for years as administrative changes affected courts, taxation, and daily life. Policies touched religious practices and social customs, creating a sense that long-standing structures were under threat. When rebellion began among soldiers who served under British command, it expanded rapidly, spreading from barracks to towns and across regions where resentment had gathered quietly. The conflict revealed fractures between cultural systems and colonial rule, showing that governance imposed without understanding could ignite resistance on a scale that transformed history. The aftermath reshaped the Empiria's presence in India. The East India Company lost political authority, and the British government took direct control. Even so, the memory of the rebellion continued to influence decision-making. Administrators understood that faith and culture were not easily adjusted to foreign expectations. Policies shifted, not as an act of generosity, but as an acknowledgement that systems built without consent were unstable. The rebellion stood as evidence that belief could become a force as powerful as any military campaign. Elsewhere in the empire, resistance unfolded through different methods. In parts of Africa, British influence arrived through treaties, trade agreements, and missionary networks. Religious missions often worked alongside administration, sometimes by intention and sometimes by circumstance. For some local leaders, Christianity appeared linked to foreign authority. They viewed conversion as a step toward accepting systems that might erode autonomy. These leaders responded not only with disagreement but with strategic refusal. They maintained their own beliefs, limited missionary access, or negotiated conditions under which foreign teachers could operate. Their resistance was measured but deliberate, grounded in the understanding that belief could shape political outcomes. In other regions, responses were more direct. Groups challenged the presence of missionaries when they believed teaching undermined traditional authority. Groups challenged the presence of missionaries when they believed teaching undermined traditional authority. They rejected instruction that demanded they abandon practices that defined their identity. They refused to let faith become a tool that justified political control. It was about self-determination. It was about deciding who had the right to speak for a community. It was about preserving space for cultural survival. Yet the story of this period was not only about rejection. Some individuals and communities embraced Christianity and reshaped it on their own terms. They adopted the elements that offered meaning and adapted them to local experience. Churches grew under local leadership. Worship took forms influenced by regional languages and customs. Converts used faith to assert independence, creating spiritual identities not controlled by the state but by the people themselves. In these instances, Christianity did not erase the past. It became part of a new future shaped from within. Acceptance, like resistance, was an act of agency. Missionaries themselves differed in purpose. Some believed deeply in their work as a source of spiritual comfort and education. They built schools, taught literacy, and provided medical care. They confronted cruelty when they saw it and challenged officials when conscience demanded it. Others operated with closer alignment to imperial expectations, supporting policies that framed conversion as progress and resistance as defiance. Faith was not a uniform force. Its impact depended on who spoke it, who received it, and how it was used. Throughout these decades, the empire attempted to manage belief through administration. It produced laws that regulated mission stations. It monitored religious gatherings. It sought to control education to shape the future of local communities. It remained personal. It remained internal. It moved through families, rituals, and memory. Attempts to direct it often strengthened the resolve of those who resisted. Attempts to suppress it revealed the limits of authority. The empire learned that faith could not be enforced. It could inspire loyalty, but it could also inspire rebellion. It could support order, but it could also challenge it. It could be a bridge or a boundary depending on how it entered a community. The same hymn that sounded like unity to one listener could sound like intrusion to another. The same church that offered refuge to some could feel like pressure to others. Belief refused to be uniform. By 1914, the empire had expanded across large parts of the world. But it had not silenced the places it governed. Resistance persisted. It lived in memory, in quiet refusal, in open protest. And in the decisions of individuals who chose their own path. Some stood against religious pressure. Some reshaped Christianity to fit their identities. Some practiced older beliefs with renewed determination. The result was not a single story of conflict, but a landscape of encounters, each shaped by the choices people made when confronted with power. The lesson of this period was clear. Faith could not be commanded. Culture could not be remade by decree. Identity could not be standardized. It was personal, even when surrounded by politics. It belonged to individuals, families, and communities. It remained beyond full control. Between 1857 and 1914, conflict and resistance revealed that authority has boundaries. It showed that empire could influence land and law, but not the private decisions of the heart. And it proved that belief, in all its forms, remained a place where people chose for themselves. Even in the shadow of global power. Christianity and the moral argument for empire 1880 to 1914. Between 1880 and 1914, the British Empire entered its late Victorian and Edwardian height. Maps in classrooms showed the world in red, and speeches in London spoke confidently of destiny. But military strength and economic expansion were not the only justifications used to explain rule. Another argument grew alongside them, expressed not through canons and trade routes, but through sermons, pamphlets, and missionary societies. It was the idea that empire existed not only for power, but for moral purpose. Supporters of expansion described the empire as a force for improvement. They argued that Britain had a duty to guide, teach, and reform societies across the world. Christianity became a central part of that narrative. Missionaries sailed to Africa, Asia, and the Pacific with Bibles and textbooks, not rifles or contracts. They opened schools, translated religious texts, and preached of responsibility. To them, expansion was not conquest, but service. In villages, mission stations appeared beside trading posts. In port cities, churches stood near administrative buildings. In some places, new medical clinics opened with the support of religious charities. The empire presented these developments as progress. Leaders in Britain described their global presence as a burden of care, a commitment to lead others toward what they viewed as improvement. They spoke of compassion, of spiritual guidance, of civilization. They insisted they were shaping a better world. For many who believed in this mission, the work was sincere. They saw poverty and hardship and wanted to help. They saw education as a pathway to opportunity. They believed Christianity offered hope, structure, and dignity. Their letters home described challenges, but also moments of connection. Students learning to read. Patients treated in clinics. Communities formed around churches and schools. These were the stories that made empire seem moral, even noble. But another perspective formed alongside it, spoken quietly at first and louder as time passed. Critics questioned whether moral language was being used to cover political goals. They saw the contradiction between compassion and control. They observed how mission schools followed trade routes, how churches appeared where authority expanded, and how spiritual work and administration often moved in the same direction. They asked why guidance required governance. They asked why improvement required rule. In some regions, traditional practices were challenged or replaced. Local spiritual leaders found their authority diminished. Cultural systems of learning and memory faced competition from new institutions. The empire described this as transformation. Critics described it as erasure. Even among those who welcomed parts of the mission, there were questions. Could there be improvement without control? Could there be education without influence? Could there be faith without power? By the 1890s, the moral argument had become central to imperial identity. Public speeches in Britain described missionaries as heroes of development. Newspapers celebrated stories of rescue, healing, and conversion. The empire presented itself as a guide for the world. The language of duty shaped policy. The language of responsibility shaped public opinion. This was power softened by principle, expansion framed as obligation. Yet on the ground, the reality was more complex. Missionaries did not control armies, but their work often existed in the spaces those armies made possible. They did not write tax laws, but their students sometimes grew into clerks who enforced them. They did not build trading monopolies, but their schools produced interpreters who communicated for them. The connection between faith and authority was never fully separate. It was a partnership, whether intentional or not. Many who lived under imperial rule recognized the benefits of education while understanding the cost of influence. Some embraced Christianity and reshaped it within their own cultural frameworks. Others resisted, defending older systems of belief. Some blended traditions, creating new forms of worship that did not mirror the versions introduced from abroad. These responses revealed something important. The world the missionaries entered was not empty. It was full of memory, identity, and history. For supporters in Britain, Christianity represented duty and compassion. They believed the empire carried a light into places that lacked it. They believed their presence was a moral act. For critics, the same narrative became a shield that defended expansion. It validated control, softened resistance, and made dominance appear benevolent. It turned questions of power into questions of guidance. 2 viewpoints, 1 history. As the world approached 1914, the argument began to strain. Rising political movements challenged both the military reality and the moral story of empire. Newspapers in colonized regions printed questions that had never appeared in British classrooms. Students trained in mission schools used the language they were taught to demand rights that had not been offered. The moral argument had opened doors, but behind those doors stood challenges that could not be silenced. Christianity and empire were never the same thing. But in the late 19th century, they moved side by side. One spoke the language of duty. The other held the instruments of authority. Between them lay both sincerity and contradiction. 2 viewpoints, 1 history. And the moral argument that once justified expansion would become one of the first ideas to be questioned when empire began to fade. World wars and changing attitudes define the years from 1914 to 1947. The empires that once ruled through confidence and certainty are pulled into conflicts that reshape the world. Old beliefs weaken. New expectations rise. Soldiers from across continents fight in the same trenches and march along the same front lines. They share danger, discipline, and the weight of war. Through this shared experience, the hierarchies that once separated ruler and subject begin to fracture. In 1914, the First World War erupts. Across Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, and the Pacific, men enlist or are recruited to serve. They fight under a flag that claims to protect them, even as it rules them. The empire presents itself as a global family, but the war reveals differences that cannot be ignored. Some soldiers return home with honor and medals. Others return with questions about equality, opportunity, and the meaning of loyalty. Churches operating across the empire face their own transformation. Religious institutions that once reflected imperial authority begin to change. Clergy from local communities take on greater responsibility. Worship shifts from foreign languages to familiar ones. Christianity begins to separate, slowly, from the political systems it once sat beside. Faith continues, but the assumption that it must stand with imperial power begins to fade. The interwar years bring reflection. The world has changed, yet empires remain. Britain holds territories across the globe, but the foundation is less stable than before. Newspapers print reports of protests, strikes, and debates over representation. Students in mission schools question why education prepares them for a world they are not allowed to lead. Community leaders speak in town halls, churches, courts, and public squares. If the empire stands for progress, they ask, why does progress not include self-rule? In many regions, veterans of the First World War become organizers of movements for independence. They speak with authority earned through service. They describe a future in which political identity matches national identity. Their experiences turn loyalty into expectation. If they fought for a world worth protecting, they argue that they should have a voice in shaping it. The empire listens, but reluctantly. 1939 brings another war. Once again, soldiers from across the empire serve on front lines, in supply units, in engineering teams, and in medical corps. This time, the war is described as a fight for freedom, for democracy, and for a better world. Those who serve begin to ask what those ideals mean when applied at home. If freedom is worth defending, why is it not extended to everyone in the empire? If democracy is the goal, why is it limited to one side of the relationship? Why is it limited to one side of the relationship? Why is it limited to one side of the relationship? Why is it limited to one side of the relationship? Why is it limited to one side of the relationship? Why is it limited to one side of the relationship? The Second World War damages the infrastructure of empire. Cities in Britain face bombing. Industry is redirected toward defense. Industry is redirected toward defense. Trade networks are disrupted. Trade networks are disrupted. The cost of maintaining global rule grows heavier than before. The cost of maintaining global rule grows heavier than before. The empire can no longer be held together by assumption. The empire can no longer be held together by assumption. It must be justified, and that justification is now weaker than ever. Independence movements grow stronger. Letters, speeches, and petitions become declarations. Some movements are peaceful. Some are confrontational. All are decisive. Britain no longer stands as the unquestioned center of its territories. Instead, it becomes one voice among many. Administrators recognize that the world they once governed is moving toward change. In churches, the distance between faith and empire widens further. Religious leaders from Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean demand autonomy. They form councils, write doctrine, and build institutions free from colonial oversight. Christianity continues, but not as a branch of imperial authority. It becomes something local, interpreted through local experience and culture. Some churches claim independence before their nations do. Others follow afterward. When the war ends in 1945, the effects are immediate. The empire is victorious, but its position is unstable. Britain faces debts, reconstruction, and a changing global landscape. The United States and the Soviet Union dominate world politics. Newly independent nations take their place in international councils. London is no longer the administrative heart of a global system. It becomes the capital of a country adjusting to a post-imperial world. 2 years later, in 1947, India gains independence. This moment becomes a dividing line. The empire that once claimed to spread progress now sees its authority recede. The justifications that once linked rule with protection and improvement collapse under the weight of history. People across the empire have witnessed war, seen sacrifice, and demanded recognition. They expect independence, not administration. They expect respect, not oversight. Between 1914 and 1947, the idea of empire loses the certainty it once held. The wars that were meant to defend the old world create the conditions that end it. Soldiers who fought for freedom return home to claim it. Churches that once partnered with authority step away to stand on their own. Faith continues where empire recedes, carried by those who choose to practice it. The world changes not suddenly, but steadily. Beliefs shift. Confidence breaks. New futures take shape. The age of empire fades. The age of independence begins. Christianity remains. Empires weaken. And the people who lived through the world wars step into a new era. Shaped by their own voices. Between 1914 and 1947, the world witnesses transformation. The wars changed belief. The soldiers changed expectation. The churches changed direction. The age of empire changes into something else. Carried forward not by conquest, but by memory, identity, and choice. After empire, a new relationship 1947 to today begins with a moment that reshaped the world. In 1947, India gained independence and the first pillar of the British imperial system fell away. Across the next decades, new flags rose in Africa, the Caribbean, and Southeast Asia. Ghana in 1957. Nigeria in 1960. Jamaica in 1962. Kenya in 1963. These were not small changes. They were entire worlds stepping forward, choosing futures beyond the reach of colonial rule. The old connection between empire and religion began to separate. Christianity remained in many regions, but no longer as a structure of authority. It was no longer tied to governors or legal systems. It no longer arrived with administrative power. Instead, faith became something different. Something local. Something chosen rather than imposed. Churches shifted from foreign oversight to independent leadership. Congregations that once looked to London or mission boards for direction began to speak in their own voices. Pastors and priests were ordained from within communities. Decisions about worship, teaching, and stewardship were made by those who lived the reality of the land, not those who governed it from afar. Faith did not vanish with independence. It changed shape. In India, church leadership transitioned to local bishops and councils. In Ghana and Nigeria, congregations blended Christian belief with long-standing cultural traditions. In the Caribbean, churches became places of community identity, music, and memory. Christianity did not withdraw. It rooted itself differently. Not as a foreign institution, but as a part of the societies that embraced it. This was not the echo of empire. It was the sound of ownership. By the 1960s, the religious landscape no longer reflected imperial power. It reflected national identity. Hymns felt different when sung by voices that carried their own history. Scripture read in a local dialect carried meaning the empire had never understood. The transformation was not sudden. It unfolded step by step, year by year, sunrise by sunrise. But it was clear. Control had ended. Belief continued. This new relationship created a shift felt on both sides of the former imperial line. Christians from the Caribbean, West Africa, and South Asia arrived and built churches that brought their worship traditions with them. Cathedrals and chapels were no longer the only homes of faith. Storefront churches, community halls, and converted cinemas became places of worship. Here, Christianity was not a memory of empire. It was a sign of global connection. In former colonies, churches became meeting places during independence movements. They hosted speeches, gatherings, and moments of decision. They offered language that nations used to argue for rights and equality. In some countries, the leaders of political movements had once been students in mission schools. They used the education they received to challenge the very system that brought it. Faith became not a chain, but a tool. This was the paradox of the post-imperial world. Structures built during colonial rule became the same structures used to dismantle it. Church literacy programs created writers who challenged authority. Mission schools taught activists who demanded representation. The skills once meant to support empire became the foundation of independence. As the years passed, Christianity changed again. It blended with local music, festivals, and customs. Christmas and Easter took on different rhythms. Worship styles adapted to climate and culture. Churches grew beside mosques, temples, and shrines in cities defined by plural belief. Faith became one part of a wider spiritual landscape. No longer dominant by position. Instead, present by choice. The empire ended. Christianity stayed. But it stayed as something transformed. It remained not as a reminder of control, but as a belief shaped by those who practiced it. It survived not through authority, but through acceptance. It adapted because people made it their own. In some places, churches became guardians of memory. In others, they became engines of social change. Feeding the hungry. Supporting migrants and refugees. Offering education where governments could not. Acting not as representatives of a foreign power, but as neighbors with open doors. In some places, churches became guardians of memory. In Britain, the shift was visible too. Cathedrals still stood, but their meaning felt different. They became historical places rather than political ones. They held ceremonies for nations that once lived under British rule, now arriving as partners, students, and citizens. Empire was no longer the context. Relationship was. In the present day, the legacy of this transition is neither simple nor uniform. In some regions, Christianity is central. In others, it is one voice among many. It does not always represent the same message. It does not always hold the same place. But it exists as a result of history, not as a continuation of it. This is the new relationship. One formed after empire. One defined not by command but by community. One where belief continues without the weight of policy. One where identity is chosen, not assigned. Independence did not erase the past. But it rewrote the future. The empire ended. Christianity stayed. Not as a shadow, but as a voice that now speaks in new languages, new homes, and new directions shaped by the people who embraced it. Thank you for traveling through history with me. The story of empire and Christianity is not a single lesson. It is a mosaic of voices, experiences, hopes, and disagreements. For some, the church brought education, medicine, and comfort. For others, it brought loss, conflict, and cultural pressure. Both stories exist. Both deserve to be remembered. Until next time, stay curious, stay thoughtful, and take care.